people, when they first get started, post pictures and samples of login forms as like an early project for not only doing front-end design, but also doing a little bit of logic and testing for form validation, which is an awesome thing to get started with. It's really a great beginner project. But I see a lot of people kind of making the same mistakes or asking the same questions. And so I wanted to do a walkthrough of implementing a simple login form. And I'm going to go off of this design really loosely. Well, in fact, maybe almost not going to go off, but just as a starting point to use this as a sample of the kind of thing we're going to do. It's just a really simple, this is a sign up form, but I'm going to do a login, assuming that you've already got an account. And we're going to validate the inputs and lay out the form simply. So starting with this, again, I'm not going to use this image, but we'll do a simple form similar to this. And I've got an editor open with nothing in it. So I'm going to make my login.html, and I'm going to get started. So I'm going to put some boilerplate HTML in here just to get us going, and this is going to be called login form, and we're going to make a div with the class login form. Yeah, login. And what are we going to have? We're going to have a couple of sections. We're going to have a little note at the top, inputs, and a button. So we're going to have div.login header, and this is going to be maybe an H1 that says login. And then we're going to have another section, and this will be called login inputs, and this will have an input. Oops, not civ. Goodness. Div, and this will have a class. I'm sorry. Within this, I'm gonna do a little input block, and the reason for that is going to be that I'm going to group my label, and this will be called. Let's just call it email. A label called email, and then below that I'm going to have an input, type text, name, email. So I'm going to have a little block for each one of my inputs, and this will be password. It'll be of the type password. That's how you get the little stars. Instead of seeing what you type, you see the little stars as you type. And this will be name, password. Okay, so there's my inputs, and now I'm going to have a button section. So I'm going to say div login buttons, and this might just start with one button called login. Let's do some kind of bootstrap style naming here. Button primary, and I'm going to ditch the button prefix and just style all buttons in a certain base way, and then probably add some color and stuff like this to my button primary. So now that I've done the basics, I'm going to add a style at the top, because that's how I'm going to just do styles here. I'm not going to do an additional file unless I really need to. So for starters, there's that. I'm going to grab my path for my file, jump over here, plug it in, and here I've got a really basic login form with no styling whatsoever. So I'm going to apply, let's do this. First of all, I need to do a CSS reset because I don't want to fight my user agent styles. And that is, if you're not familiar, the browser automatically applies some styles. For instance, you can see this H1 is going to be a good example. You can see the yellow on the top and bottom is the margin that's been applied. And if you look over in the box model down here, in the bottom right of the screen, you can see 21.433. It's got a value applied to margin, and I didn't do it. It's because your browser automatically is going to add some styles to H1s amongst many other tags. So I want to clear that out. I don't want the margin and the padding, because those are the ones that I always end up fighting for some reason. And star just means everything. So for starters, nothing is going to have a margin or padding. And then I'm going to do to my entire body, I'm going to give a background color, and I generally do this with just about everything. Give a really faint off-white so that my white elements will stand out against it. I'm going to select my login class, which includes my entire form, and I'm going to give it a width of, I feel like 300 pixels is probably comfortable for a login form like this. I'm going to give it a height of, actually I'm not going to designate its height and just allow it to automatically adjust. I'm going to give it padding all around of 20 pixels. We'll see how that goes. I'm going to give it a margin of 100 pixels top and bottom, and auto to center it. I want it to have a background color of white. And what else? I want it to have a border that's solid 1 pixel, and I'm going to start off with black and select here in my editor a kind of gray. I don't like a too dark. It depends on the background color, you know. You want it to contrast, but black can look a little too harsh. Okay, background color border. What am I missing? I like to imagine as much of this as I can, you know, in my head before jumping over and testing it. I'm going to do a text align center. What am I missing? It's going to be centered. We'll have a background color. We'll have a border. I want a border radius. Nothing crazy. Let's do like 8 pixels. Okay, let's see how that looks, and we can jump back over and do some other things. Cool. Okay, so this is roughly what we want. I'm going to go back to this, and I'm going to steal their colors because that's part of the reason why I did this. Example is because I like these colors, or at least this color. And one way to do this, and I do this frequently, is go into your DevTools and use the selector to just select any element on the page, and then give that element a random color style, and just make it black or whatever is easiest to type fast. And then click on it, and you can use the eyedropper then to select a color. And so now I've got the hex code for this purple that I like. And I'm going to jump over and make a CSS variable called color primary and set it to that color that I just sampled. So now in my login, what is this called? In my login header, the H1 that's in there, not high, the H1, thank you. It's going to have a color of this. Oh, I'm sorry. I should use my variable. Oops, color primary. And I just realized something else, that I want my font family globally to be not this serifed font, which has the little feet and I think looks kind of stodgy, like a little overly formal. I'm going to set my font family to sans serif. What else do I know I'm going to need to do? So we'll reload. Looks a little bit better. So after each of these blocks, I want a little bit of space. And really, because I've only got 3. So what I mean is, I'm sorry, that was kind of jumping ahead. Login, I want some breathing room under login. Some space between login and my inputs. And under my inputs, I want some space between the inputs and the button. So what I could do is just target my input section and give this a margin top bottom of 30 pixels, 0 pixels, and that gives it a little bit of space. It might still be a little too tight. Let's call it 40. We can adjust this later. But that is for my login inputs. Is this margin, and it also makes me realize that the padding all around on my overall form is maybe too small. Let's do 30 on the top and bottom and 40 on the right left and see how that looks. Looks a little better. Why didn't this get applied? Login, sorry. Okay, so now I'm going to style this section. And so remember, I put these in blocks. You know, I did this for a reason. So I'm going to say for my input block, I'm going to style it a certain way. So within an input block, what I want these is I want these to stack. I don't want them to display in line. And the easiest way to do that is to target every direct descendant. This is the direct descendant selector, and this is the all selector. So everything that is directly nested within an input block, in this case just the label and the input, is going to have a display of, what do I want? Block. So that they'll go on separate lines. Let's see if that did the trick. It did, but remember my text align is still center, so I want to text align this left. And now my label is lined up. And now the problem is my input is not spanning the full width because I'm selecting this guy, so I'm a display block. So what I need to do is do my input block, the input in particular. In fact, you know what? I could probably make all of these full width because it wouldn't matter. I was going to say I need to make the input full width, but if I make the label full width as well, it won't really matter because it's got its own line as it is. So if I set width to 100%, now this guy goes over here, but now my concern is maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks on me, but this space looks a little bit bigger than this space, and that's likely because any margin or padding that's on this input field is causing it to exceed the width. It's adding to its length, or to its width, sorry. So if I, just out of curiosity, if I say box sizing, border box, you see that? If I toggle that between border box and unset, you see how border box shrinks it down just a little bit. And what that does is it causes any kind of margin or padding on an element not to increase its width. So I'm just going to copy this just so that I know where to start at width there. And there I've got box sizing, border box on this, and then I'm going to style my buttons, style my inputs, and I'll be done with the styling portion. So I've got this button primary class. So I'm going to style all buttons in this. Oops. Targeting the button element. I'm going to style them all the same and give them a font size of, I don't know, 16 pixels, color of white, background color. I'm sorry, that should be on the specific type of button. I want them to have padding of, I don't know, 8 pixels top and bottom and 12 pixels right and left. And then we got font size padding. I want a border. I want no border, but I want a border radius of 6 pixels. Might be too much. Let's just see. And then I'll do my button primary class that I copied a second ago. And I will give it a color of white and a background color of that variable that I did before. Are you not going to give it to me? Come on now. Usually it'll just figure it out. Okay, what am I missing? Am I missing anything? Let's see. Okay, looks good enough. I want a little more right and left padding. Right, left. Let's do this. That looks pretty good. 42. Gosh, seems like a lot, huh? I could probably just do 40. Okay, now we need to do our inputs. This should be pretty easy. So what I'm going to do is on my input block, I'm going to do a input block. I want to do a margin at the bottom, but I only want it on the first one. So I'm going to say nth of type 1. I could do this in different ways, but this will be one way to do it. And I'll say margin bottom 30 pixels. Let's see how that looks. So this should only target the first instance of input block. So that, because I don't want to have a bunch of extra margin at the bottom of my other input block, because if you remember, my whole input section has a top bottom margin of 40, which would effectively make the space between my last input and the button beneath it 70 pixels, which I don't want to do. So I only want this between my first and my second input. So there we go. That looks a little bit better. Now I need to style the input itself. Login input block. So what I'll do is input block. I just want to style the input. Is that correct? Is that right? Input block input. And I'm going to probably do this in the browser, but just to give it something to start with, I'm going to say font size 16 pixels as well, and that'll make sure that style shows up. So now we'll say padding. What do I want? Let's do 5 pixels top bottom, 8 pixels right left. That looks a little bit more comfortable. I'll do a border radius of like 4 pixels, something real soft, and we'll say border. Did I already set a border on this? 1 pixel black, and then let's just see what looks good. Actually, after I set my background color, if I do a background color of, I'm just going to start with something really ugly and then adjust it. Oh, you know what? I'll sample this purple and make this kind of like a really light shade of this purple. See if that looks all right. Cool. And then I'll also, for the border, sample this purple. That looks a little funky, but is that like all right? That's kind of cool. I kind of liked it more in this direction, to be honest with you. Yeah, let's call it. Let's say that. Copy these, and I forgot what I changed here, so I'm just going to copy all of them. Ba-ba-bum. Nice. Okay, I really don't like this border color on the entire login form, so I'm going to change that real quick, make it something a little lighter. I used to love box shadow, but not so much lately. Okay, what did I just change that to? I hate RGB. Okay. I'm going to set the login border to this, and let's make it a hex color. Thank you. Okay, so now we've got our login form. The next thing that we're going to want to do is wire up these buttons to do something, right? And I've got a kind of interesting idea for how I'd like to approach this, which is to create a kind of simulated backend service that we would use to check these login credentials. Because I feel like this is an easy thing to brush over and just say, oh, just, you know, you're just doing front end. Just check to see whether or not the person put their name or password in. But in reality, the front end dev's job is also going to be to submit these to a back end service, however you end up handling this, and then receiving a response. And since we're not actually going to be deploying any back end code, and we don't have to worry about servers or lambdas or anything like that, you can just write this in a separate JavaScript file, since imports are now native in ES6. And you can import it as a service. I haven't done this in vanilla JavaScript in a while, but I think this should be a much more interesting way to do it. Import this as a service and then check against a kind of simulated backend. And this would be a really good practice that's more like what the real world is like for validating user inputs. So I'm going to break this up into 2 sections, and when we come back, I'll work on validating the input as well as sending that input once it's validated to a simulated backend that will then give you a response about whether or not that user is allowed to access the site. So when we get back, we'll look at that.